A mountain man swore he never wanted kids, until the woman he hated became pregnant with his child. It starts high in the frozen Rockies, where a widow storms after a lone mountain drifter, pistol raised, ready to avenge her husband's death. But just as she pulls the trigger, the earth gives way, burying them under roaring snow and trapping them side by side in the dark. As the wind howls outside, ugly Tarias and buried lies claw their way into the light. She swears he murdered her husband, yet he tells her a different story, a story of a secret scheme, forged land papers, and men in the shadows who will kill to keep their secrets buried. But the real shock comes when the widow feels the first signs of new life growing inside her, life that ties her to the man she once vowed to kill. And now, dangerous riders are closing in, ready to silence her forever. If the mountain man truly never wanted a child, what will he do now that protecting this one means saving the woman who once aimed a gun at his heart? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. Arya Talbot drew the worn, leather cinch strap tight against her mare's belly in the pale morning light. The supply shed's weathered boards cast long shadows across the frosted ground of silver pine. Her fingers trembled slightly as she secured the buckle, but her jaw was set with grim determination. The early spring air bit sharp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and melting snow down from the high country. She checked her saddlebags one final time: ammunition, dried beef, hard biscuits, and an extra wool blanket. The weight of her husband's Colt revolver pressed against her hip, foreign and heavy. Jonas had tried teaching her to shoot it proper, but she'd always declined, saying she had no need for such things. Now she wished she'd listened closer. The tracks leading away from town were fresh, no more than a day old. One set of boots, accompanied by mule prints that sank deep in the soft earth. Arya had learned enough from Jonas about tracking to recognize the distinctive pattern of a mountain man's sure-footed mule, Jack Draven's mule. "The Lord is my shepherd," she whispered, touching the small Bible in her coat pocket. But the familiar words brought little comfort. The good book spoke of turning the other cheek, but it also spoke of justice. After what Draven had done to Jonas, justice was all she had left. Arya swung into the saddle, adjusting her thick wool coat against the morning chill. The mare shifted beneath her, sensing her tension. They set out at a steady pace, following the tracks as they wound their way up into the Rockies. As the morning wore on, the terrain grew steadily more challenging. The trail switched back and forth across the mountainside, climbing higher with each turn. Stands of aspen gave way to dark spruce and fir. The air grew noticeably thinner, making both horse and rider breathe harder with the effort of ascent. By midday, the first snow flurries began to dance in the air. Arya pulled her collar higher, squinting against the white specks that stung her cheeks. The tracks were getting fresher. She'd gained ground on him, though the weather worried her. Up here, a spring storm could turn deadly in minutes. The mare's hooves crunched through patches of crusty snow as they rounded a steep bend. Arya reined up short, her heart suddenly hammering. There, perhaps 200 yards ahead, a man was chopping wood near a rocky ledge. Even at this distance, she recognized Jack Draven's broad-shouldered frame and the distinctive slouch hat he wore. Arya dismounted silently, tethering her horse behind a stand of young firs. Her hands shook as she drew Jonas's revolver. She'd pictured this moment countless times over the past months, but now that it was here, a strange hollowness filled her chest. She crept forward, using the scattered boulders for cover. Draven continued his work, seemingly oblivious to her presence. The steady thunk of his axe echoed off the mountainside. 50 yards now. 40. The wind picked up, carrying the first heavy flakes of real snow. Arya raised the Colt, sighting down its barrel just as Jonas had once shown her. "Steady hands make true aim," she heard his voice whisper in her memory. She drew a deep breath, held it, and squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked across the mountainside like breaking ice. Draven jerked and stumbled, his hand flying to his shoulder. The axe clattered against stone as he dove behind a massive boulder. Arya's heart pounded in her ears as she waited for return fire, but none came. "Mrs. Talbot," Draven's voice carried clearly through the thickening snow. "I know it's you. I ain't drawing on you." Arya advanced carefully, keeping the revolver trained on his position. Small spots of blood marked the snow where he'd moved. "You killed my husband," she called back, her voice raw with emotion. "You killed Jonas and left him in that ravine like he was nothing. That ain't what happened." The wind caught Draven's words, almost tearing them away. "You're being misled, Mrs. Talbot. I found Jonas, yes, but I didn't kill him. There's things you need to know." "Liar!" Arya's finger tightened on the trigger. "Jonas trusted you. He said you were an honest man for all your wild ways, and you murdered him for those claim papers." The wind howled across the ridge now, driving the snow sideways. Arya blinked against the stinging flakes, trying to keep her aim steady. She could see Draven's hat above the boulder and a glimpse of his coat. "I ain't armed, Mrs. Talbot," he called out. "Check my belt if you don't be jack of me. My rifle's with my gear by the woodpile. I won't move." Arya hesitated, her thoughts churning like the storm around them. Everything in her screamed to finish what she'd come to do. But something in Draven's voice, a note of raw honesty, made her pause. "Why should I be Jackie anything you say?" she demanded, edging closer to his position. The snow was falling heavily now, thick white curtains that reduced visibility with each passing minute. "Because Jonas was my friend." Draven's words carried a weight of genuine grief. "I've been tracking the men who really killed him. The mining syndicate—" "Stop!" Arya's voice cracked. "Don't you dare speak his name! Don't you dare try to twist things around!" But doubt had crept in, unwanted and persistent. If Draven had meant to kill her, he'd had plenty of chance while she was approaching. And she knew, deep down, that he was one of the finest shots in the territory. Her wild shot shouldn't have merely grazed him. The wind screamed across the ridge with renewed fury, drowning out all other sound. The temperature was dropping rapidly as the storm settled in. Arya's fingers were growing numb around the revolver's grip, and she could barely see 20 feet ahead through the whirling snow. "Mrs. Talbot! Arya!" Draven called out again. "We need to get to shelter. This storm's turning bad. My cabin's less than a mile from here. You can keep me at gunpoint all you want, but we need to move now, or we'll both freeze." Arya stood frozen, not just from the cold, but from the impossible choice before her. Every fiber of her being had been focused on this moment of vengeance for so long. But now, faced with the reality of it, uncertainty gnawed at her resolve. The storm's growing fury added urgency to her decision. "Show me your hands," she ordered, her voice barely carrying over the wind. Slow and careful. Draven's hands appeared above the boulder, empty and bleeding slightly from his wounded shoulder. "I give you my word, Mrs. Talbot. Once we're out of this storm, I'll tell you everything I know about Jonas. Everything. But right now, we need to move." Arya's finger trembled on the trigger as snow collected on her eyelashes. The temperature was plummeting, and already she could feel the dangerous bite of real mountain cold through her coat. The storm had caught them both, turning her simple mission of vengeance into a fight for survival. The wind howled again, drowning out all thought. Arya stared at Draven's raised hands through the curtain of white, her heart pounding with fear, grief, and uncertainty. The choice before her was stark. trust the man she'd come to kill, or risk them both freezing to death on this mountainside. The storm raged around them, indifferent to their human drama, while Arya stood at the crossroads of vengeance and survival. The snow continued to fall, erasing tracks, hiding Tarja, and forcing decisions that would change both their lives forever. She kept the revolver steady, aimed at Draven's chest, but her voice wavered as she spoke. "Start walking toward your cabin. Slow. Any sudden moves and I'll finish what I came here to do." "Yes, ma'am," Draven answered simply. He moved carefully from behind the boulder, his wounded shoulder leaving a trail of red drops in the fresh snow. His face was grave but calm as he met her eyes. "Follow my tracks exactly. The terrain's treacherous up here, especially in a storm." Arya watched him take the first steps through the deepening snow, her thoughts as turbulent as the weather around them. She'd come seeking justice, or what she'd thought was justice. Now she wasn't sure of anything except the need to survive the next few hours. The wind cut through her coat like a knife as she followed Draven's careful progress. The storm had transformed the mountain into a white void, with visibility dropping by the minute. Arya kept the revolver trained on Draven's back, but her fingers were so numb she wasn't sure she could pull the trigger if she wanted to. Their progress was agonizingly slow. The snow was nearly knee-deep in places, and the wind threatened to knock them off their feet. Arya found herself watching Draven's boots, placing her feet exactly where he stepped. Despite everything, she had to admit he moved with the sure-footed confidence of someone who knew these mountains intimately. Through the howling white, Arya caught glimpses of the man she'd come to kill. He favored his wounded shoulder but never complained. When she stumbled once, he half-turned as if to help her, then thought better of it. There was something in his manner that didn't match the cold-blooded killer she'd imagined these past months. The storm continued its assault as they made their way through the white wilderness, the fate of both hunter and hunted now tied together by nature's fury. Arya's questions would have to wait. For now, survival took precedence over vengeance, and the Tarja about Jonas's death remained buried like the landscape around them, hidden, but not forgotten, beneath the relentless Rocky Mountain snow. The wind's howl transformed into a deafening shriek. Snow whipped sideways through the air, turning the world into a white blur around Arya and Jack. Their earlier confrontation had shifted into a desperate march through deteriorating conditions, with Arya keeping her revolver trained on Jack's back as he broke trail through deepening drifts. "We need to move faster," Jack shouted over his shoulder, his words nearly lost in the tempest. "Storm's worse than I thought." Arya could barely see him through the thickening curtain of white, though he was only a few paces ahead. Her fingers had grown so numb she could hardly feel the revolver's grip. "How much further?" she called back, fighting to keep her balance as another gust threatened to knock her sideways. Before Jack could answer, a deep rumbling sound cut through the storm's roar. Arya looked up, her heart stopping as she saw the wall of white bearing down on them from the ridge above. The entire mountainside seemed to be moving. "Avalanche!" Jack's shout pierced through her moment of frozen terror. He lunged toward her, grabbing her arm with surprising strength. "This way!" Arya's instincts screamed to pull away from him, but the approaching wall of snow left no time for hesitation. She felt herself being yanked sideways toward what looked like a dark crack in the mountainside. The rumbling grew to a thunder that shook the ground beneath their feet. They half ran, half stumbled through the deep snow. Arya glimpsed a narrow opening in the rock face just as the avalanche caught up with them. Jack practically threw her forward into the crevice, diving in after her as the world disappeared in a roaring whiteness. The sound was overwhelming, a combination of freight train and explosion that seemed to go on forever. Arya pressed herself against the cold rock wall, eyes squeezed shut as snow poured past the entrance. She couldn't tell if she was screaming. All sound was swallowed by the avalanche's fury. Then, gradually, the roaring subsided. A different kind of silence settled over them, the muffled quiet of being buried in snow. Arya coughed, trying to clear the powder from her throat and nose. Her eyes struggled to adjust to the sudden darkness. "Mrs. Talbot?" Jack's voice came from nearby, rough with concern. "Are you hurt?" Arya became aware of various aches and scrapes, but nothing seemed seriously injured. I'm all right," she managed, her voice shaky. She could hear him moving in the darkness, and her hand instinctively went to her hip. But the revolver was gone, lost in their desperate scramble for safety. "Hold still," Jack said. There was a scratching sound, then a match flared to life, illuminating his face for a moment before he touched it to the wick of a battered brass lantern. Warm light filled their refuge, revealing a narrow mining crevice that extended about 15 feet into the mountain. Jack set the lantern down carefully and began checking her for injuries, his movements efficient but respectful. "No broken bones from what I can tell. You've got some scrapes on your hands, but nothing too serious." Arya pulled away from his examination, pressing her back against the rough rock wall. "Stay back," she warned, though her voice lacked its earlier conviction. The events of the past few minutes had left her badly shaken. Jack nodded and moved to inspect the crevice's entrance. Snow packed it almost completely, leaving only a small gap near the top that let in a weak gray light. The storm's muffled howl continued outside, and even as they watched, more snow sifted through the opening. "We're sealed in pretty tight," he reported, probing the packed snow with careful fingers. "Trying to dig out in this storm would be suicide. We'll have to wait it out." Arya felt a flutter of panic in her chest. Trapped in a tiny space with the man she'd come to kill, it was like some sort of terrible joke. "How long? Storm this size?" Jack considered, running a hand through his snow-dusted hair. "Could be a day or more before it blows itself out. Then we'll need to wait for the snow to settle some before we try digging out. Avalanche snow sets up hard as concrete if you give it time." He began gathering what gear had made it into the crevice with them. Arya watched as he collected his pack, which had somehow stayed on his shoulder during their mad dash for safety. A dented coffee pot had rolled into one corner. His bedroll, though wet with snow, looked intact. "We should take stock of what we have," he said, setting the items in the lantern's pool of light. "Temperature's going to drop once night sets in." Arya hugged herself, already fee-jacking the cold seeping through her wet clothes. The crevice offered shelter from the wind, but the rock walls held no warmth. She watched as Jack inventoried their supplies, laying everything out methodically. "Got some jerky and hardtack in my pack," he reported. "Couple of dried apples, too. Canteen's full, and there's snow to melt if we need more water. Coffee makings, thank the Lord. One bedroll, somewhat dry in the middle. Lantern's got enough oil for a day or so if we're careful." He glanced at her, his expression carefully neutral. "Your pistol's probably buried under 20 feet of snow by now." Arya met his gaze steadily, though her heart was still racing. "Doesn't matter, I've got my boot knife." Jack nodded, unsurprised. "Reckon you do, and I've still got mine. But Mrs. Talbot, right now our quarrel's got to take second place to surviving this storm. We're going to need to work together, or neither of us is walking out of here." As if to emphasize his words, a particularly strong gust of wind drove a spray of snow through the gap above, making the lantern flame dance. The temperature seemed to drop another few degrees, and Arya couldn't quite suppress a shiver. Jack noticed. He reached for his pack again, and pulled out a worn but clean flannel shirt. "Here, you need to get out of those wet things, at least the outer layer. I'll turn my back, give you what privacy I can." Arya stared at the offered shirt, then at Jack's face. She saw no guile there, just practical concern. Still, she hesitated. "How do I know I can trust you?" "Same way I have to trust you won't put that boot knife in my back while I'm turned around," he replied evenly. "We're past having much choice in the matter." The cold made her decision for her. Arya took the shirt with stiff fingers. Jack turned to face the rock wall, keeping his word. She changed quickly, removing her snow-soaked coat and outer shirt. The flannel was warm and soft, smelling of wood smoke and pine needles. It hung almost to her knees. "Decent," she announced, and Jack turned back around. He nodded with approval at seeing her wet things already spread out on a rock ledge to dry. She might want him dead, but she clearly knew how to handle herself in the wilderness. The wind outside rose to a higher pitch, and the temperature dropped further. Arya couldn't stop shivering now, despite the dry shirt. The crevice was turning into an icebox as the storm raged on. Jack studied her for a moment, then sighed. "Mrs. Talbot, we've got one bedroll between us and a long, cold night ahead. I know you've got every reason to distrust me, but we need to share body heat or we might not make it till morning." Arya stiffened. "I'm not—" "I give you my word as a mountain man," he interrupted quietly. "I mean you no harm. Never did. You can keep your knife handy if it makes you feel safer. But I've seen too many good people die of exposure to let pride or fear add two more to that count." The sincerity in his voice gave Arya pause. The cold was becoming dangerous. She could feel it in her bones, in the way her thoughts were starting to move more slowly. She looked at Jack. Really looked at him for the first time since she'd started hunting him. His face was weathered but honest, his eyes direct. The wound she'd given him earlier had stopped bleeding, but she could see the pain it caused him in the way he held his shoulder. Yet he'd still managed to save her life when the avalanche came. Nothing made sense anymore. If he was the murderer she'd bejacked him to be, why hadn't he left her to the avalanche? Why save her, only to share the last of his supplies? The wind howled outside their shelter, and Arya made her decision. "All right," she said finally. "But I'm keeping my knife." "Wouldn't expect anything else," Jack replied. He spread the bedroll on the smoothest part of the cave floor, then arranged himself with his back against one wall, leaving space for her to lie down without touching him. Arya settled herself cautiously, her back to him, the knife close to her hand. She was acutely aware of his presence behind her, but the bedroll blocked the worst of the cold, rising from the stone floor. "Try to get some rest," Jack said quietly. "Storm's got to burn itself out eventually." Arya didn't respond, but she felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. The lantern's flame flickered, casting dancing shadows on the rock walls. Outside, the wind continued to roar, piling snow higher against their shelter. They were well and truly trapped now, predator and prey forced into an uneasy truce by nature's fury. The cold pressed in around them, but the shared warmth slowly began to fight it back. Arya lay awake, listening to Jack's steady breathing behind her, wondering how everything had gone so wrong. She'd come seeking vengeance, certain of her course. Now nothing was certain except the storm that raged beyond their rocky shelter and the long night ahead. Morning crept into the crevice with pale fingers of light seeping through cracks in the snow wall. Arya's eyes felt gritty from a night spent mostly awake, hyper-aware of every movement Jack made. The lantern had burned low, casting weak shadows across their cramped shelter. Jack stirred first, carefully keeping his distance as he rose, His wounded shoulder had stiffened overnight, and he winced as he tested it. "Need to check that entrance," he muttered, more to himself than to Arya. Arya pulled herself up, smoothing down her borrowed flannel shirt. She watched as Jack approached the packed snow that sealed them in, noting how he favored his left side. The wound she'd given him. Her stomach twisted at the memory, though she quickly suppressed the feejacking. "Snow's set up hard as iron," Jack reported after probing the barrier. He dug at it with his hunting knife, but the packed snow barely chipped. "Must be 15, 20 feet deep at least. Avalanche snow compresses tight." Arya hugged herself against the morning chill. "So we're trapped." "For now." Jack sheathed his knife and began examining the crevice walls more closely. "This looks like an old prospecting pocket. Might be other passages, air shafts. Miners usually dug ventilation holes." He moved slowly along the walls, fingers tracing the rough stone. Arya kept her distance, settling near their makeshift camp. Her boot knife lay within easy reach as she watched him work. "Here," Jack said after several minutes. "Feel this draft?" He pointed to a narrow crack above head height. "There's airflow. If I can widen it some, might give us better ventilation at least. Air's getting stale in here." Arya had noticed the thickness of the air, but hadn't wanted to mention it. "How long will that take?" "Hours, maybe longer. Rock's soft in spots, though. Looks like they abandoned this shaft before hitting anything worthwhile." He reached for his pack, pulling out a small prospector's pick. "Best get started." As Jack began carefully chipping away at the rock around the crack, Arya sorted through their remaining supplies. 6 strips of jerky, half a pouch of coffee, some hard tack, and dried apples. She laid everything out methodically, portioning it into careful rations. The steady chip, chip, chip of Jack's pick filled the silence. Arya couldn't stand it anymore. "Tell me about Jonas," she demanded suddenly. Jack's pick paused mid-swing. He didn't turn around. "What do you want to know?" "The Taria. Why did those men kill him? What was his connection to you?" Jack resumed his work, but slower now. "Jonas got himself tangled up with some dangerous folks. Mining syndicate trying to forge claim papers. They needed someone who knew the local boundaries, someone respectable." "You're lying!" Arya snapped. "Jonas would never involve himself with criminals." "Times were hard," Jack said quietly. "Ranch was struggling. They offered him money, just to sign a few papers, they said. Make a few claims look legitimate." Arya's hands clenched into fists. "No, he wouldn't." "Found out later they were killing people for their claims. Honest prospectors, families." Jack's pick struck harder now. "Jonas wanted out, tried to back away. They wouldn't let him. And you? Where do you fit in all this?" A long pause filled only by the sound of falling rock chips. "I was tracking them. Had a friend killed over a claim dispute. Was gathering evidence, trying to build a case for the territorial marshal." "Convenient story," Arya said bitterly. She turned away, busying herself with the coffee pot. The familiar routine of measuring grounds helped steady her shaking hands. "Too bad there's no one alive to confirm it." Jack worked in silence for several minutes before responding. "Check Jonas's desk at home. False bottom in the right drawer. He kept letters." Arya's hands stilled on the coffee pot. How did he know about Jonas's desk? The question burned, but she couldn't bring herself to ask it. Instead, she poured cold water over the grounds, wishing they dared risk a fire. By late afternoon, Jack had opened a narrow shaft about 4 inches wide. Fresh air seeped in, cutting the stuffiness. The wind outside had settled to occasional gusts, but the packed snow at the entrance remained solid as stone. Arya had spent the day keeping herself busy, reorganizing their supplies, straightening the bedroll, anything to avoid conversation. But in such close quarters, she couldn't help observing Jack. He worked steadily despite his injured shoulder, stopping only to drink water or stretch his aching muscles. Not once did he complain or try to blame her for his wound. As evening approached, Jack finally set aside his pick. "Need to arrange things better for tonight," he said. "If you're agreeable, I can clear that corner for sleeping. Rock's smoother there." Arya nodded stiffly. Whatever her Jack-hongs about sharing space with him, practical matters had to come first. While Jack worked on the sleeping corner, she did another inventory of their food. One day's rations gone already. If they were careful, maybe 3 days left. Silence fell except for the steady drip of melting ice somewhere in the darkness. Arya found herself studying Jack's profile in the lantern light, trying to reconcile the quiet, capable man before her with the murderer she'd Jackie'd him to be. Nothing added up anymore. His words about Jonas's desk kept coming back to her. The false bottom. She'd never known about it. But if Jack was telling the Taria, that meant Jonas had been hiding things from her even before his death. The thought hurt worse than the cold. As darkness gathered outside their shelter, the temperature dropped again. Arya wrapped her arms around herself, dreading another sleepless night. The lantern flame flickered, throwing shadows on the wall that seemed to mock her certainties. Jack finished arranging their sleeping area and stepped back. "Should be more comfortable tonight," he said quietly. "Got most of the sharp rocks cleared away." Arya nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She was exhausted, confused, and increasingly uncertain about everything she'd backed when she'd set out to hunt this man. Jonas's face floated in her memory, but now she found herself wondering if she'd ever really known him at all. The steady drip of melting ice marked time as they settled in for another long night. Arya lay rigid in the darkness, her mind churning with questions she wasn't ready to ask and answers she wasn't sure she wanted to hear. The first pale light of dawn crept through the narrow air shaft, casting a thin beam across the rocky floor. Arya woke to the sound of Jack rummaging through his pack. She'd dozed fitfully, her dreams filled with Jonas's face and fragments of conversations she could no longer fully remember. Jack dumped the contents of his pack carefully onto a flat rock, sorting through items with methodical precision. Arya sat up straighter, instantly alert when she spotted something that made her heart skip. A broken survey marker, its metal surface dulled with age, and beside it a small leather-bound ledger wrapped carefully in oilskin. "What are those?" Her voice came out sharper than she'd intended. Jack's hands stilled. He glanced at the items, then at her, his expression guarded. "Part of what I was telling you about." Arya pushed herself to her feet, ignoring the stiffness in her joints. "Show me." He hesitated, one hand resting protectively on the ledger. "Some of this ain't pretty reading." "Show me," she repeated, her tone leaving no room for argument. After a long moment, Jack nodded. He gathered the items and held them out, though she noticed how reluctant he seemed to let them go. Arya snatched them quickly, retreating to her corner of the crevice where the morning light was strongest. The survey marker was standard issue, the kind used to mark legal claim boundaries, but it had been Jackberately broken. Arya turned it over in her hands, noting the registration numbers that had been partially filed away. She set it aside and unwrapped the oilskin from the ledger with trembling fingers. The book's pages were filled with careful notes in different hands. Dates, locations, claim numbers, and scattered throughout, sets of initials that made her blood run cold. MS and RW appeared frequently, often alongside notes about adjusted boundaries and compensated transfers. "These initials," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Marcus Shepard and Robert Wells?" Jack looked up from where he'd been preparing their morning coffee ration. Yes. Arya's fingers tightened on the ledger. Jonas mentioned those names once. Last spring, at our kitchen table. He was upset about something, but he wouldn't tell me what. The memory surfaced with painful clarity, Jonas's face drawn with worry, the way he'd quickly changed the subject when she'd asked questions. They were the ones running the scheme, Jack said quietly, using local ranchers and merchants to make their claim jumping look legitimate. Arya flipped through more pages, her heart pounding as she recognized other names, people she knew, respected members of the community. Some had disappeared or died in accidents over the past year. All these people, some were willing participants. Others got pulled in without understanding what they were really part of. Jack's voice carried a weight of knowledge she wasn't ready to accept. By the time they realized, it was too late to back out easily. Like Jonas? The words caught in her throat. Jack didn't answer immediately. He poured their coffee into tin cups, the familiar aroma filling the cramped space. He tried to make it right at the end. Tell me how he died. Arya looked up from the ledger, forcing herself to meet Jack's eyes. The Tarja this time. Jack passed her a cup of coffee before settling back against the rock wall. His injured shoulder seemed to trouble him more this morning, though he tried to hide it. It was in one of their mining tunnels. Jonas had agreed to meet me there, said he had proof of what they were doing. But they must have followed him. He paused, taking a slow sip of coffee. Arya waited, hardly breathing. There was a cave-in, probably not an accident. They'd been known to collapse tunnels on people who became problems. I heard it start and tried to reach him in time. Jack's voice grew rough. Got close enough to grab his hand, but the whole ceiling came down. By the time I dug through, he trailed off, the memory clearly paining him. Arya stared into her coffee, watching the grounds swirl in the dark liquid. The ledger lay heavy in her lap, its pages filled with evidence she couldn't deny. Every entry seemed to mock her certainty, her be-Jackif that she'd known her husband completely. Around midday, Jack melted snow in their dented coffee pot and added the last of their jerky to make a thin stew. The warm broth helped fight the persistent chill, but Arya barely tasted it. She kept returning to the ledger, reading and rereading entries, looking for anything that might contradict Jack's story. Instead, she found only more confirmation. The afternoon stretched long and cold. Jack returned to working on the air shaft, widening it gradually with his pick. The steady rhythm of metal striking stone filled the silence, while Arya lost herself in the pages of the ledger. She recognized Jonas's handwriting in places, careful notes about property lines and water rights. Had he known what that information would be used for? When had he realized the Tarja? As evening approached, the temperature dropped sharply. Arya pulled her coat tighter, trying to focus on the ledger's pages in the fading light. Jack had moved their lantern closer to where he worked, leaving her in relative shadow. She didn't mind. The darkness felt appropriate to her mood. One entry caught her eye, a date she remembered. The day Jonas had come home late, looking troubled, saying he'd been helping Marcus Shepard with some paperwork. She'd served him dinner and asked no questions, trusting him completely. Now she wondered how many other times he'd carried secrets to their table. He wasn't a bad man, Jack said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. He'd paused in his work, leaning on his pick. Just got in over his head trying to save your ranch. That doesn't make it right. Arya closed the ledger, no longer able to bear its revelations. No, it doesn't. Jack resumed his digging, each strike of the pick punctuating his words. But understanding why people do wrong things isn't the same as excusing them. They settled into silence as true night fell, the temperature plummeting further. Arya huddled in her corner, while Jack sat opposite, the lantern between them casting long shadows on the walls. The ledger lay beside her, its presence almost physical in the quiet. Everything she'd bejacked when she'd set out to hunt Jack had been built on assumption and grief. Now those foundations were crumbling, leaving her uncertain what remained true. She thought of Jonas's desk at home, wondering what other secrets might be hidden in its false bottom. The cold pressed in around them, but Arya barely noticed it. Her mind was too full of questions. About Jonas, about the men who'd used him, about her own hunger for vengeance that had led her up this mountain. She glanced at Jack, seeing him differently now. Not a murderer, but perhaps the only person who truly knew how Jonas had died trying to make things right. They sat in uneasy quiet as the night deepened, each lost in their own thoughts while the wind whispered through the narrow air shaft above. The lantern flame flickered, making their shadows dance on the walls like restless spirits. Arya wrapped her arms around her knees, fidgeting more alone with her shattered certainties than she had in all the months since Jonas's death. The broken survey marker caught the lantern light, its damaged surface a testament to the violence that had claimed her husband's life. But now she wondered if that violence had started long before the cave-in, with small compromises and desperate choices made at their own kitchen table. The Tariya, she was learning, had more edges than she'd imagined, and each one cut deep. Morning light filtered weakly through the narrow air shaft, casting a pale beam across the cramped space. Jack sat examining the rough-hewn walls of their shelter, his experienced eyes noting the tool marks left by previous miners. His shoulder ached from yesterday's work on the ventilation shaft, but something about the wall's texture had caught his attention. He ran his fingers along a section where the rock changed color slightly. "Arya," he called softly. "There's something here." Arya looked up from where she'd been rereading the ledger. Her eyes were red-rimmed from lack of sleep, but alert. "What is it?" Jack worked his fingers into a narrow gap. "Feels like there's a space." He grunted with effort, then something shifted. A rusted metal box, about the size of a Bible, slid partially free from where it had been wedged into a natural crack in the rock face. "Must have been left by the original prospectors," he said, carefully working the box free. The metal was corroded, but the latch still held. He set it down between them in the lantern. Light. Arya set aside the ledger and leaned forward. "Can you open it?" Jack worked at the latch with his hunting knife until it gave way with a sharp crack. The lid creaked open, revealing several envelopes inside. The paper had gone stiff and yellow with age, but they'd been protected from complete decay by the box's seal. Arya reached for them with careful fingers. The first envelope was water-stained but intact. She turned it over and gasped softly. This is Jonas's handwriting." Jack went very still. The envelope was addressed simply, "Arya." Her hands trembled as she broke the seal. The paper inside was covered in Jonas's familiar script, though the ink had faded to brown. Arya moved closer to the lantern and began to read aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. "My dearest Arya, if you're reading this, I reckon I couldn't make things right after all. I've been trying to find the courage to tell you the Tariya, but shame keeps the words stuck in my throat. Now I fear it's too late for anything but this confession. Last spring, when the cattle prices fell, and the bank was pressing us hard, Foreman Barrett Ruddock came to me with what seemed like an answer to our prayers. The mining syndicate needed help with some claim filings. Nothing illegal, he said, just helping sort out overlapping boundaries. The money they offered would have saved our ranch. But it was all lies, Arya. They were using my knowledge of the territory to forge claims, pushing honest folks off their land. By the time I understood what I was really part of, Ruddock had enough evidence to ruin me, to ruin us both. I tried to back out. Told Ruddock I wouldn't help anymore. He laughed and said I should think about what might happen to you if I didn't cooperate. Said accidents were common in mining country. I've been meeting with a man named Jack Draven. He's been gathering evidence against the syndicate. Says he might be able to help me make this right. I pray he can, because I can't bear the weight of what I've done much longer. If I don't make it home, know that everything I did, wrong as it was, I did trying to save our home. I'm sorry, Arya. So sorry for all of it. All my love, Jonas. Arya's voice broke on the last words. She sat back, the letter trembling in her hands. The pistol she'd kept close for days lay forgotten in her lap. Jack reached for another envelope, this one addressed to him. The return address showed his brother's name. He opened it carefully and scanned the contents, his expression growing grave. This is from my brother Thomas, dated 3 days before Jonas died, he said quietly. He was helping us gather evidence against the syndicate. Says Jonas came to him, desperate to back out of something. Was terrified what Ruddock might do. Jack paused, swallowing hard. Thomas tried to convince him to go to the marshal, but Jonas was afraid of leaving you unprotected. Arya pressed her hands to her face, shoulders shaking. When she looked up, her eyes were wet with tears. I've been so wrong, she whispered, about everything, about you. The lantern flame wavered, making shadows dance across the rock walls. Jack set the letters down carefully. We were all wrong in different ways. Ruddock and his people, they're experts at using good folks against each other, making us see enemies where we should see allies. Jonas was trying to protect me. Arya's voice was hollow. All those nights he came home troubled, all those conversations that stopped when I entered the room. I thought he'd stopped trusting me, but he was carrying this terrible weight. He was a good man caught in a bad situation, Jack said softly. When he finally came to me, he was ready to risk everything to expose what they were doing. That's why they followed him that day. Arya picked up Jonas's letter again, running her fingers over the familiar handwriting. Did he know? At the end, did he know you were trying to help him? Jack nodded slowly. In those last moments, before the tunnel came down, he looked me in the eye and said, "Tell Arya the Tarya." Those were his last words. The silence that followed was heavy with shared grief. Arya read the letter again, and then a third time, as if trying to hear Jonas's voice in the written words. Jack sat quietly, giving her space to absorb the painful revelations. Hours passed. The beam of light from the air shaft tracked across the floor as the sun moved overhead. Neither of them felt much like eating, though Jack eventually made coffee, passing a cup to Arya without comment. All this time, Arya said finally, I've been holding on to anger because it hurt less than grief. Easier to blame someone than accept that Jonas died trying to fix his own mistakes. Anger can keep us warm, Jack agreed quietly, but it burns up everything else in its path if we let it. Arya looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time since the avalanche had trapped them. The wound she'd given him was still visible beneath his bandaged shoulder, but his eyes held no accusation. I shot you, she said, the words catching in her throat. I came up here planning to kill you, and you still saved my life when the snow came down. Wouldn't have been right to let you die for wanting justice, Jack replied simply, even if you had the wrong target. Arya gathered the letters carefully, returning them to the metal box. Her hands had stopped shaking, but her world felt fundamentally altered, as if everything she'd be Jackoved had been picked up and set down again in a different arrangement. Ruddock, she said, the name bitter on her tongue. He's still out there, isn't he? Still using people, still destroying lives? Yes. Jack's voice hardened slightly. That's why I've been gathering evidence. The Territorial Marshal's office is building a case, but they need witnesses willing to testify. That's what Jonas was going to do before they killed him. Arya finished. The thought. She touched the grip of the pistol in her lap. Not with intent now, but thoughtfully. All this time I've been hunting the wrong man, when the real killer has probably been sleeping sound in his bed. Ruddock's day will come, Jack said firmly. But it needs to come through the law, not frontier justice. Otherwise, we're no better than him. Arya nodded slowly, then gathered the letters and ledger together. Her movements were Jack berate, like someone waking from a long dream. When we get out of here, she said, I want to know everything. About the syndicate, about what Jonas was trying to do, all of it. You deserve the whole, Taria, Jack agreed, however hard it is to hear. They sat in silence as afternoon light slanted through the air shaft. The lantern burned low, but neither moved to trim it. Each was lost in thought, Arya processing the shattering of her certainties, Jack carrying the weight of a Taria finally told. The letters lay between them like a bridge across months of misunderstanding. Outside, snow continued to press against their shelter, but inside, the bitter cold of vengeance had begun to thaw, making way for something more complicated but ultimately more healing than rage. Arya waited until Jack's breathing deepened into sleep before letting her tears fall. The letters lay in the metal box beside her, each page heavy with revelations that tore at her soul. Shadows from the guttering lantern danced across the crevice walls as she wrapped her arms around herself, trying to contain the storm of emotion threatening to break free. The night stretched endless, each hour marked by the slow drip of melting ice and the occasional settling of snow outside their prison. Arya's mind circled relentlessly through memories of Jonas, his troubled expression at breakfast, the way he'd touch her shoulder before riding out, those final weeks when distance had grown between them like winter frost. Every memory now carried new weight, new meaning that crushed her beneath waves of shame. She'd been so sure, so righteous in her anger, and all along, Jonas had been trying to protect her, while she'd hunted an innocent man. Her bullet had torn Jack's flesh, and still he'd saved her from the avalanche. The thought made her stomach clench. As false dawn began to lighten the air shaft, Arya couldn't bear the confines of the crevice any longer. She rose quietly, stepping over their scattered gear towards the packed snow blocking the entrance. Her fingers, bare and trembling, clawed at the frozen mass. She needed out. Needed to run from the Taria of what she'd done, what she'd become in her grief. The snow was like ice, but she kept digging, her hands growing numb as she tore at the barrier. Blood began to streak the white where her nails split against the frozen surface. Arya! Jack's voice came sharp with alarm. Stop! She ignored him, attacking the snow with greater desperation. I have to get out. I have to... Strong hands gripped her shoulders, pulling her back. You'll freeze to death. Let me go! She struggled against his hold, voice rising. I don't deserve your help. I tried to kill you. I would have killed you. But you didn't. His voice remained steady, though his grip was firm. Arya, stop. Your hands are bleeding. I don't care. The words tore from her throat. Everything I be-Jacobed was wrong. Everything I've done. Jonas died trying to make things right, and I've spent months destroying whatever good he tried to do. I shot you. Her voice broke on a sob. Listen to me. Jack turned her to face him, his expression fierce in the dim light. What matters now is surviving. We can't change what's done, but we can choose what we do next. Arya sagged in his grip, the fight draining from her. How can you even look at me after what I did? Because I understand grief." His voice softened. "I understand what it means to let pain turn you into someone you don't recognize." She looked up at him then, seeing the shadows in his eyes. Her hands throbbed with cold, and she suddenly realized she was shaking violently. Jack noticed too. Without comment, he shrugged out of his heavy coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. "You're already cold," she protested weakly. "I've got my wool shirt." He guided her away from the entrance, back toward their small fire. "Sit. Let me look at your hands." Arya allowed herself to be settled near the flames. She watched numbly as Jack retrieved his canteen and a clean cloth from his pack. He knelt beside her, taking her hands in his with surprising gentleness. The water stung as he cleaned away the blood and packed snow. "Why are you being kind to me?" she whispered. Jack continued his careful ministrations before answering. "Because holding on to bitterness is what got us both here in the first place." When he finished tending her hands, he added wood to their fire and settled beside her, close enough to share warmth but not touching. The flames cast dancing light across their faces as morning crept fully into the air shaft above. "I lost 3 siblings to measles when I was 12, Jack said suddenly, his voice quiet but clear in the stillness. Sarah was 10, Michael was 8, and little Rebecca had just turned 6. It swept through our settlement in less than 2 weeks. Arya turned to look at him, but his gaze remained fixed on the fire. "I helped nurse them," he continued. "Watched them burn with fever, heard them cry for water I couldn't give them enough of. My mother, she never really recovered. Died herself that winter. Father took to drinking, and I took to the mountains." He paused, drawing a deep breath. "Swore I'd never be a father myself. Couldn't bear the thought of loving children only to lose them." "Is that why you live alone up here?" Arya asked softly. He nodded. Seemed safer. No attachments means no one to grieve for. A bitter smile touched his lips. "Didn't work out quite like I planned. Still found people to care about. You're Jonas among them." Arya pulled his coat tighter around her shoulders, breathing in the leather and wood smoke scent of it. "I was so lonely those last months," she admitted. "Jonas would come home looking haunted, but he wouldn't talk to me. We'd sit at the same table, sleep in the same bed, but it felt like he was 1,000 miles away." She wiped at her eyes. "I thought he'd stopped loving me. Never occurred to me he was trying to protect me." "He loved you fierce," Jack said. "Talked about you every time we met. How smart you were, how strong. Said you deserved better than what he'd gotten you into." "I just wish—" her voice caught. "I wish he'd trusted me enough to tell me the Tarja. Maybe I could have helped somehow. Or maybe you'd both be dead." Jack's voice was gentle but firm. "Ruddock's people don't leave loose ends." They sat in silence as the fire burned lower. Arya's hands had stopped throbbing, though they remained tender. The coat around her shoulders was warm with Jack's lingering body heat. She felt hollow, scraped clean of the anger that had sustained her for so long. "What happens now?" she asked finally. "First, we survive." Jack reached for more wood. "Snow's still too deep to dig out. We wait for it to settle and melt some. Then—" He hesitated. "Then you decide what you want to do with the Tarja, you know." Arya nodded slowly. "I want to help bring them down. Ruddock and his whole operation. I owe Jonas that much." "It won't be easy," Jack warned. "Or safe." "I don't care about safe anymore." She met his gaze steadily. "I care about right." The fire popped, sending sparks upward towards the air shaft. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving clear sky visible through the narrow opening. But the snow remained packed deep around their shelter, holding them in this moment of raw honesty. Exhaustion began to settle over them both, emotional as much as physical. Arya found herself swaying slightly where she sat. Without discussion, they arranged their bedrolls near the fire, close enough to share its warmth, but maintaining a careful distance between them. Arya lay down, still wrapped in Jack's coat. "Thank you," she murmured, "for stopping me this morning, for telling me about your family." "Get some rest," he replied softly. "We've got more hard days ahead." She closed her eyes, forjacking the weight of Taria and grief pressing down like the snow above them. But there was something else too, a tiny spark of purpose where before there had been only vengeance. It wasn't peace, not yet, but it was something like hope. They drifted off to sleep as pale sunlight filtered down through the air shaft, neither touching but somehow less alone than they had been before. Outside, the sky stretched clear and blue over the snow-buried mountains, holding them in this suspended moment of transformation. Morning light filtered through the narrow air shaft, casting weak shadows across their confined shelter. Jack worked steadily at widening the opening, his muscles burning from the repetitive motion of scraping and digging. Small chunks of snow and ice fell around him as he stretched upward, tool in hand. Arya watched him from her place near their dwindling woodpile, counting out the remaining pieces. "How much longer do you think the wood will last?" "Maybe tonight, if we're careful." Jack's voice was strained as he reached higher. "The shaft's getting wider, but we're still a good 15 feet from the surface." She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to ward off the growing chill. Their breath had started forming visible clouds in the air. "The temperature's dropping. Storm's coming." Jack climbed down from his perch, brushing snow from his shoulders. "I can smell it." They shared a meager lunch of the last jerky and melted snow. Arya's hands shook slightly as she lifted the dented tin cup to her lips. The cold was seeping deeper into the crevice with each passing hour, and their supplies were dangerously low. As afternoon faded into evening, Jack gathered the remaining firewood into a careful pile. "We'll need to make this last." Arya helped him arrange the precious kindling. Their fingers brushed occasionally as they worked, neither pulling away as quickly as they might have days ago. The shared task felt intimate somehow, both of them aware that their lives depended on making these few pieces of wood last through the night. Darkness fell early, as it always did in the mountains. The temperature plummeted with frightening speed. Even with the small fire burning, their breath frosted in the air. Arya huddled closer to the flames, her teeth beginning to chatter. "Here." Jack handed her his coat again, but she shook her head. "You need it too." Her voice trembled with cold. "We both know there's not enough wood to keep us warm tonight." He looked at her for a long moment, then settled beside her. "Come here," he said quietly, opening the coat. "We'll share." Arya hesitated only briefly before sliding closer, allowing him to wrap both coat and arms around her. His body was solid and warm against her back. She told herself it was just survival, just necessity, but something inside her chest ached at the gentle way he tucked the coat around them both. "Thank you," she whispered, trying to stop shaking. "You're still too cold." His breath stirred her hair as he spoke. He pulled her closer, rubbing his hands along her arms to generate warmth. The fire crackled softly, throwing dancing shadows across the crevice walls. Arya gradually stopped shivering as Jack's body heat seeped into her. She found herself relaxing against him, head resting back against his shoulder. "I'm scared," she admitted into the darkness. "I don't want to die up here." His arms tightened around her. "We're not going to die." "You don't know that." She turned her head to look up at him. "The wood won't last the night. The temperature's still dropping. could both freeze before morning. Arya, his voice was rough with emotion. I won't let that happen. Why do you care? The question slipped out before she could stop it. After everything I did, because you're worth caring about. His hand came up to brush a strand of hair from her face. Because you're brave and strong and beautiful, even when you're trying to shoot me. A sound caught between a laugh and a sob escaped her. I was so wrong about you. We were both wrong about a lot of things. His fingers lingered against her cheek. Arya turned fully in his arms to face him. The fur jacket caught the gold flecks in his eyes, usually hidden behind his guarded expression. But there was no guard now, only warmth and something deeper that made her breath catch. Jack? She reached up to touch his face, tracing the line of his jaw. If this is our last night? He caught her hand in his, pressing a kiss to her palm that sent shivers through her that had nothing to do with cold. Don't talk like that. I need you to know. She struggled to find the words. These past days, being trapped here with you, I've seen who you really are, and I... His mouth covered hers before she could finish, gentle but insistent. Arya melted into the kiss, her hands sliding up to tangle in his hair. All the fear and lawn-jackness of the past months seemed to dissolve in the warmth of his embrace. The kiss deepened, grew more urgent. Jack's hands roamed her back, pulling her closer until she was straddling his lap. The coat fell forgotten around them as they explored each other with increasing desperation. Are you sure? He whispered against her throat. Yes, she breathed, already working at the buttons of his shirt. Please. Their remaining clothes fell away piece by piece. The cold air raised goosebumps on exposed skin, but neither noticed. They were lost in each other, in the need to feel alive and connected in what might be their final hours. Jack's hands were surprisingly gentle as they moved over her body, mapping every curve and hollow. Arya arched into his touch, gasping his name. The stone walls of their shelter seemed to fall away, leaving only this, the press of skin on skin, shared breath, the overwhelming sensation of being truly seen and wanted. They moved together slowly at first, then with increasing urgency. Arya clung to his shoulders, head thrown back as pleasure built between them. Jack murmured endearments against her skin, words of praise and wonder that made her heart swell. When release finally claimed them, it was like falling into light. Arya cried out softly, Jack's name on her lips like a prayer. He followed moments later, face buried in her neck as he shuddered against her. They collapsed together on their shared bedroll, breathing heavily. Jack reached for the coat, pulling it over them both. Arya curled into his side, head resting on his chest where she could hear his heartbeat gradually slowing. I never expected this, she whispered into the quiet. His hand stroked slowly up and down her back. Neither did I. The fire burned lower, casting red embers across the snow-packed entrance. Outside, the wind howled through the mountains, but here in their small shelter, wrapped in each other's arms, they found a moment of peace. Arya traced idle patterns on Jack's chest, fijacking the steady rise and fall of his breathing. Do you regret it? No. His answer was immediate, certain. He tilted her chin up to look at him. Whatever happens tomorrow, I could never regret this night with you. She kissed him softly, trying to memorize the fee-jacking of his lips against hers. When they parted, she settled back against his chest, pulling the coat tighter around them both. The last pieces of wood smoldered in the fire pit, providing barely enough light to see by. Cold pressed in around their small pocket of warmth, but neither moved to add more fuel to the dying flames. They both knew there was nothing left to burn. Instead, they held each other closer, sharing what heat remained between their bodies. Sleep came in fits and starts, neither willing to waste these precious hours unconscious. They talked softly in the darkness, about their lives before, about the people they'd lost, about the way fate had brought them together in this place. As the fire died to ash, leaving only the faintest red glow, Arya pressed herself closer to Jack's warmth. His arms tightened around her protectively, as if he could shield her from the biting cold with nothing but his own body. They drifted off together as the temperature continued to drop, clinging to each other in the darkness. Their shared intimacy had changed something fundamental between them, though neither could say exactly what. All they knew was that they were no longer alone in facing whatever morning might bring. The night grew colder, and they slept fitfully, wrapped in Jack's coat and each other's arms. Outside, snow continued to pile against their shelter, but inside, they had found an unexpected warmth in each other's embrace, a flame that burned brighter than any fire could. The first pale light of dawn filtered through the narrow air shaft, casting weak shadows across the cramped space. Arya stirred first, momentarily confused by the warmth pressed against her back and the weight of an arm draped over her waist. Then memory flooded in. The desperate intimacy of the night before, the sharing of warmth that had led to so much more. Her cheeks flushed hot despite the morning chill. She eased away from Jack's sleeping form, careful not to wake him as she gathered her scattered clothing. The cold air raised goosebumps on her skin as she dressed quickly, keeping her back turned. Behind her, she heard Jack shift and wake. The silence grew thick between them. Arya busied herself with her boots, focusing intently on each lace as if it required all her concentration. She could hear him dressing, the rustle of fabric, somehow deafening in the confined space. "I should check the entrance," Jack said finally, his voice rough with sleep. "See if the snow's settled enough to dig through." "Yes," Arya agreed quickly, still not looking at him. I'll see about getting a fire going." He gathered his tools and moved to the snow-packed entrance, leaving awkward space between them. Arya knelt by the cold fire pit, hands trembling slightly as she arranged the few remaining pieces of kindling. The familiar task helped steady her, gave her something to focus on besides the memory of his hands on her skin, his breath against her neck. The morning passed in heavy silence, broken only by the scrape of Jack's tools against packed snow and the occasional crack of burning wood. Arya kept the fire small, painfully aware of their dwindling fuel supply. They shared the last of their jerky without speaking, both pretending to be absorbed in their tasks. As the weak sunlight reaching through the air shaft indicated midday, Arya rose to help sort their remaining supplies. The movement sent the world spinning suddenly. She sat down hard, pressing a hand to her forehead as dizziness washed over her. "Arya?" Jack's voice held concern, but she waved him off without looking up. "Just stood too quickly," she mumbled. "I'm fine." But as she sat there, waiting for the spinning to stop, awareness began to creep in. When had her monthly courses last come? With all that had happened, tracking Jack, the avalanche, their days trapped here, she hadn't noticed being late. But now, her hand drifted to her belly as memories surfaced. The slight nausea she'd dismissed as anxiety, the tenderness in her breasts she'd blamed on the cold, the dizziness that seemed to come more frequently. Horror and understanding bloomed together. With child. She was with child. The revelation struck her like a physical blow. Fear clawed at her throat as implications cascaded through her mind. unwed, carrying a child conceived in what might have been their last desperate hours. What would people say? How could she face returning to town? And Jack? She glanced at his back as he worked at the snow barrier. He had told her of his fears about fatherhood, his pain over lost siblings, his certainty that he wasn't meant for family life. How could she burden him with this? They weren't even certain to survive their escape from this place. No, she couldn't tell him. Not now, when their very lives hung in the balance. There would be time enough for such revelations if they made it out alive. For now, she had to focus on survival. Arya pushed herself to her feet more carefully this time, fighting back another wave of dizziness. She forced herself to move, to be useful, though her thoughts whirled like the snow outside. Her hand kept straying to her middle when Jack wasn't looking, wondering at the tiny life that might be growing there. The afternoon brought progress as Jack's steady work finally broke through to open air. The hole was narrow, barely wide enough for an arm, but the sight of blue sky beyond brought tears to Arya's eyes. Hope and fear tangled in her chest as she watched him widen the opening. "We might be able to make it through by tomorrow," Jack said, pausing to wipe sweat from his brow despite the cold. "The snow's settling, getting more compact, easier to cut through?" Arya nodded, not trusting her voice. She turned away to hide the emotion on her face, busying herself with preparing their final meal. The stew was thin, mostly melted snow with the last bits of jerky and dried vegetables, but the warm broth helped settle her churning stomach. They ate in continued silence as darkness crept in. Arya found herself studying Jack's profile in the fur jacket, seeing him with new eyes. The strength in his shoulders as he worked, the gentleness in his hands as he passed her a cup of broth, the quiet determination that had kept them alive these past days. Would their child have his eyes, his stubborn chin? She pushed the thoughts away. Such dreams were dangerous. They had to survive first. Everything else could wait. "We should save the last of the wood," Jack said as evening deepened. "Keep the air fresh for tomorrow's work." Arya helped him bank the small fire until only the faintest glow remained. The darkness pressed close, but it was familiar now after so many nights. They settled onto their shared bedroll, keeping careful distance between them despite the cold. Sleep proved elusive. Arya lay on her back, one hand resting lightly over her belly. The enormity of what was growing inside her, this secret life, this unexpected miracle, overwhelmed her. Fear and wonder twisted together until she could hardly breathe. What kind of mother would she be? She who had come seeking vengeance with a loaded gun. How could she protect this child in a world that had already taken so much from her? And what of Jack? Did she have any right to bind him to her with this unplanned responsibility? Beside her, she could tell from his breathing that Jack was also awake, likely planning tomorrow's escape attempt. The space between them felt vast, despite their physical proximity. Last night's intimacy seemed like a dream, yet its consequences were all too real. Arya curled onto her side, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Her other hand remained pressed to her middle, as if she could somehow shield this tiny secret from the world's harsh realities. Tomorrow they would fight their way free of this frozen prison. Tomorrow they would face whatever waited in the world beyond. But tonight, in the darkness, she held her silence and her secret close, torn between fear of the future and a growing tenderness she hadn't expected to feel. Sleep came slowly, filled with dreams of tiny hands and gentle eyes, of a future she dared not voice aloud. Above them, through the narrow breach in their prison of snow and stone, stars wheeled across the mountain sky. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. For now, Arya guarded her secret in the darkness, while beside her, unaware, Jack planned their escape from the frozen trap that had brought them together in ways neither could have imagined. Dawn brought a subtle shift in the air, a softening that whispered of change. Arya felt it as soon as she woke. The crushing weight of cold had lifted slightly, replaced by a dampness that spoke of warming snow. Jack noticed it too. He was already at the entrance tunnel, testing the packed snow with his tools. "It's giving way easier," he called back to her. "The warmer air's working in our favor." Arya pushed herself up carefully, fighting the now familiar wave of dizziness. She forced herself to eat a few bites of their remaining food, knowing they would need strength for what lay ahead. "What can I do to help?" "We'll work in shifts," Jack said, not looking back. "I'll dig until I tire, then you take over while I rest. Slow and steady wins this race." They fell into a rhythm as the morning wore on. Jack would dig and scrape until his arms trembled. Then Arya would take his place, attacking the snow with desperate determination. The work was exhausting, but the snow yielded more easily than before. Their narrow breathing hole gradually widened into a real tunnel. Hours passed in a blur of white-packed snow and aching muscles. Arya's back screamed in protest, but she forced herself to continue. She couldn't let her condition slow them down, not when freedom was so close. Just past noon, Jack's tool broke through the last barrier. Brilliant sunshine poured through the opening, so bright after their days of lantern light that they both had to shield their eyes. "We made it," Arya whispered, tears freezing on her cheeks. "We actually made it." Jack widened the hole until they could crawl through. Arya went first, Jack's hand steady at her waist as he helped her navigate the narrow passage. As she emerged into the open air, the vast whiteness of the transformed landscape took her breath away. The world had become a glittering expanse of white, unbroken save for the dark shapes of trees. The avalanche had reshaped the entire mountainside, burying their previous reality under tons of snow. Arya stood shakily, legs weak after days of confinement, and drew in deep breaths of crisp mountain air. Jack emerged behind her, carrying their salvaged gear. He scanned the landscape with experienced eyes. "We need to move careful," he said. "Snow's still settling in places. One wrong step could trigger another slide." Arya nodded, suddenly aware of how precarious their position remained. They weren't safe yet. Not by far. "What about your mule?" she asked, remembering the animal had been with him when she'd first confronted him on the ridge. "If he survived, he'll have found shelter down lower," Jack said. "He's mountain smart, knows to head for the ravines when weather turns." They began their descent, picking their way carefully across the transformed landscape. Jack led the way, testing each step before committing his weight. Arya followed in his footprints, trying to focus only on the next step, then the next. Her body ached with fatigue, and nausea rolled through her in waves, but she forced herself to keep moving. The sun tracked slowly across the sky as they made their way down the mountain. They found Jack's mule, as he'd predicted, sheltering in a deep ravine where the wind had swept the snow into deep drifts, leaving patches of bare ground. The animal greeted Jack with a soft whicker, seemingly none the worse for its ordeal. "Good boy," Jack murmured, checking the animal over. "Smart old fellow." They loaded their meager gear onto the mule and continued their descent. The afternoon light began to fade, painting the snow-covered world in shades of pink and gold. Arya's steps grew increasingly unsteady as exhaustion and pregnancy sickness took their toll. "My cabin's not far now," Jack said, glancing back at her with concern. "Just over that next ridge." Arya nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She concentrated on putting one foot in front of the other, fighting waves of dizziness. The secret growing inside her seemed to sap her strength with every step. Darkness was falling when they finally crested the last ridge. Below them, barely visible in the gathering dusk, sat a small cabin. Smoke still rose from its stone chimney. Someone had been maintaining the fire during Jack's absence. "Neighbor checks on it when I'm away," Jack explained, seeing her questioning look. "Keeps the fire going so the pipes don't freeze." The sight of that thin stream of smoke rising into the darkening sky nearly undid Arya. Tears sprang to her eyes as the reality of their survival hit her. They had made it. They were alive. Her legs chose that moment to give out. Arya stumbled, the world spinning around her. She felt Jack's strong arms catch her before she could fall. "I've got you," he said softly. Then, when she couldn't make her legs work properly, "Here, let me." He scooped her up as if she weighed nothing, cradling her against his chest. Arya wanted to protest that she could walk, but she was so tired. So very tired. She let her head rest against his shoulder as he carried her down the last stretch of trail to the cabin. The structure was small but solid, built of rough-hewn logs with a sod roof now buried under snow. Jack somehow managed to open the door while still holding her, ducking to enter the low doorway. The interior was simple but neat. A pot-bellied stove squatted in one corner, its fire burning low but steady. A narrow bed filled another corner, while basic furniture, a table, 2 chairs, some shelves, occupied the remaining space. Everything spoke of utility rather than comfort, but after their days trapped in the crevice, it seemed like luxury. Jack set her gently in one of the chairs. "Let me get this fire built up proper," he said, moving to the stove. "Then we'll see about some tea." Arya watched through half-closed eyes as he added wood to the fire and filled a battered kettle with snow to melt. The warmth from the stove gradually filled the small space, seeping into her tired bones. She hadn't realized how deeply cold she was until she began to thaw. When Jack pressed a cup of weak tea into her hands, she nearly cried at the simple comfort of it. The warm liquid helped settle her churning stomach, though she knew the nausea wasn't entirely from exhaustion. "There's the bed," Jack said, gesturing to the narrow cot. "You should rest. I'll make do out here." Arya wanted to protest, to insist she could sleep on the floor, but exhaustion dragged at her like weights. She managed to stumble to the bed, barely taking time to remove her boots before collapsing onto the thin mattress. Someone, Jack, draped a blanket over her. Through heavy eyes she watched as Jack settled himself in the far corner, wrapped in his coat. The emotional distance that had grown between them since that night in the crevice reasserted itself, though somehow softened by all they had endured together. They had survived. They had escaped. Everything else, all the complicated fee-jackings and unspoken tarias between them, could wait for tomorrow. Arya's hand crept to her belly as sleep pulled her under. In the morning, she would have to face the reality of her condition and what it meant for both their futures. But for now, she let exhaustion claim her, falling into deep sleep with the sound of Jack's steady breathing across the cabin and the crackle of the warming fire. Dawn crept over the mountain peaks, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of rose and gold. Inside the cabin, Jack stirred from his uncomfortable position near the stove. His muscles protested after sleeping on the hard floor, but he moved quietly, not wanting to wake Arya. He glanced toward the bed where she slept, her face finally peaceful after days of tension. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her cheeks seemed hollower than before their ordeal. The sight stirred something protective in his chest that he wasn't ready to examine too closely. Shaking off the fawjacking, Jack pulled on his heavy coat and boots. Outside, the morning air bit sharp and clean. He gathered fresh snow in 2 buckets, noting how the warmth of yesterday had already given way to another hard freeze. Back inside, he set the snow to melt on the stove for washing and coffee. While the snow melted, he climbed carefully onto the cabin's roof. Several days of heavy snow had taken their toll. He found loose shingles and a spot where water had worked its way under the sod, threatening to rot the support beams below. The damage would need attention before the next storm. Inside the cabin, Arya woke to the sound of footsteps overhead. Her stomach rolled unpleasantly as she sat up, and she pressed a hand to her mouth, willing the nausea to pass. The morning sickness seemed worse with each passing day, though she knew it was still early in her condition. "You all right?" Jack called down through the roof boards, having heard her stirring. "Just tired," she managed, the lie bitter on her tongue. "The climb down yesterday took more out of me than I expected." "There's warm water for washing," he said, "and I'll have coffee ready soon." Arya nodded, though he couldn't see her. She waited until the worst of the nausea passed before rising carefully to her feet. The cabin swayed around her for a moment, but she steadied herself against the wall and made her way to the wash basin. The warm water helped clear her head, though she couldn't bring herself to do more than nibble on a piece of hard tack. Jack came down from the roof as she was finishing, stamping snow from his boots. "Roof needs work," he said, pouring them both coffee. "But it'll hold for now. We need fresh meat more urgently. I saw rabbit signs when we came down yesterday." "Be careful," Arya said, surprising herself with the genuine concern in her voice. Jack's eyes met hers briefly. "Always am." He checked his rifle, gathered some basic supplies, and headed out into the morning. Left alone, Arya tried to keep busy. She swept the cabin's floor, organized their meager supplies, and attempted to rest. But worry gnawed at her. Worry about her pregnancy, about the danger they still faced from the mining syndicate, about what the future might hold. By late afternoon, she had worn herself into exhaustion just trying to keep her thoughts at bay. The cabin door opened, bringing a blast of cold air, and Jack, successful from his hunt. A plump rabbit hung from his belt. "Found fresh tracks out there," he said, his voice tight with concern. "Not animal, human. More than one set, probably 3 or 4 days old." Arya's hand went instinctively to the pistol she still kept close. "The syndicate? Could be ordinary trappers." Jack didn't sound convinced of the latter. "Either way, we need to be cautious." Arya took the rabbit and began preparing it for cooking, grateful for the familiar task to occupy her hands. The small cabin filled with the savory smell of rabbit stew, reminding them both how long it had been since they'd had a proper meal. They ate in relative silence, but it wasn't the same tense quiet of their first night in the cabin. This silence felt heavier with things unsaid. Dangers unspoken, secrets kept, fayjackings neither was ready to name. After they'd finished eating, Jack finally spoke. "Those letters we found. They proved the syndicate's corruption. The forged claims, the threats against Jonas, all of it." Arya set down her cup carefully. "We should take them to the marshal in Silverpine." "Not yet," Jack warned. "Ruddock has friends in town. We need to be smart about this. The wrong move could get us both killed." "Like Jonas," Arya whispered. Jack's face softened with sympathy. He tried to do the right thing in the end, tried to back out, when he realized how deep it went. "That's why—" He trailed off, but Arya could finish the thought. "That's why they killed him." "What do we do now?" she asked. "For tonight we rest. Tomorrow I'll check the area more thoroughly. See if I can figure out who left those tracks. We need to know if we've been found." Arya nodded, but her hand strayed unconsciously to her belly. The decision to keep her condition secret felt heavier with each passing hour. She knew she should tell him. He had a right to know, and the danger surrounding them made it even more important. But fear held her tongue. Fear of his reaction, fear of how it might change things between them, fear of admitting to herself how much she had come to depend on his quiet strength. "You should take the bed again," Jack said, breaking into her thoughts. "I'll sleep near the stove. We both need proper rest if we're going to stay alert." "You could," Arya started, then stopped herself. What had she been about to suggest? That they share the narrow bed? The memory of their night together in the crevice rose unbidden, bringing heat to her cheeks. "I'm fine here," Jack said quietly, seemingly understanding what she couldn't say. He spread his bedroll near the stove and added more wood to the fire. Arya retreated to the bed, but sleep proved elusive. Through the cabin's single window, she could see the moon rising over the snow-covered peaks. Its light cast long shadows across the floor, and every creak of the cabin's settling timbers made her start. She watched Jack's broad shoulders rise and fall with steady breathing, wondering if he was truly asleep or just pretending for her benefit. The secret of her pregnancy felt like a physical weight on her chest. She opened her mouth several times to speak, but the words wouldn't come. What would he say if she told him? Would he feel trapped? Obligated? Would he push her away? Or worse, would he stay with her out of duty rather than choice? The questions chased themselves through her mind, keeping sleep at bay. Outside, a wolf howled in the distance. Arya pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, acutely aware of how vulnerable they were. Somewhere out there, unknown men had passed near this cabin. Men who might work for Ruddock, who might even now be closing in on them. And here she was, carrying a child she hadn't planned for, depending on a man she'd meant to kill just days ago. The irony of it might have made her laugh if it wasn't so terrifying. Instead, she lay in the darkness, one hand resting protectively over her belly, listening to Jack's steady breathing and the pop of wood in the stove. Tomorrow, she told herself. Tomorrow she would find the courage to tell him. But as the night wore on, she knew she was lying to herself. The fragile peace between them felt too precious to risk, even as guilt gnawed at her conscience. The moon tracked slowly across the sky, casting its cold light through the window, until finally, exhaustion overcame worry, and Arya drifted into an uneasy sleep. Her last conscious thought was a prayer, for protection, for guidance, and for the strength to face whatever dangers tomorrow might bring. Morning light spilled through the cabin's single window, casting long shadows across the rough-hewn floor. Arya watched as Jack gathered his axe and headed outside to split wood. The temperature had dropped overnight, leaving frost crystals sparkling on the window panes. She knew they needed more firewood, and despite the queasiness in her stomach, she felt restless sitting idle. Wrapping herself in a worn shawl, Arya stepped out into the crisp mountain air. Jack looked up from his work, pausing with the axe raised. "You should stay inside where it's warm," he said, his breath forming clouds in the cold. "I can help," Arya insisted, moving towards the woodpile. "I'm not made of china." Jack's expression softened slightly. "Reckon you've proved that well enough?" He split another log with practiced ease, the sharp crack echoing off the surrounding trees. Arya began gathering the split pieces, stacking them carefully against the cabin wall. The work helped warm her, but after a few minutes, the familiar dizziness returned. She tried to ignore it, reaching for another piece of wood. The world tilted suddenly. The log slipped from her grasp as black spots danced before her eyes. She heard Jack call out her name, his voice seeming to come from very far away. Strong arms caught her before she hit the ground. Through the haze, she felt herself being lifted, cradled against Jack's chest as he carried her swiftly into the cabin. He laid her gently on the bed, his weathered face creased with concern as he checked her pulse. "Aria, can you hear me?" She nodded weakly, the room still spinning. Jack tucked blankets around her, his movements careful but sure. The weight of her secret pressed against her heart, demanding to be spoken. She couldn't keep it from him any longer. "Jack," she whispered, catching his wrist as he turned to get water. "I need to tell you something." He stilled, watching her face intently. Aria drew a shaky breath, forcing the words past her dry throat. "I'm with child," she said. The confession hung in the air between them. "Your child." Jack's face went completely still. For a long moment he didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe. Then guilt flashed across his features, followed by something deeper, a mixture of fear and wonder that made him look suddenly vulnerable. "How certain are you?" he asked quietly. "As certain as I can be." Aria's fingers twisted in the blanket. "All the signs are there. I've been hiding the sickness, but—" She trailed off, watching his reaction. Jack sank slowly onto the edge of the bed, his broad shoulders bowed under the weight of this news. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "I'm sorry, Aria. That night in the crevice, I never meant to burden you with this responsibility." "Don't," Aria said quickly. "Please don't apologize. I'm the one who should be sorry. I didn't tell you sooner because I was afraid—" Jack's hand covered hers, stopping her words. "No more apologies," he said firmly. "What's done is done. That child's life is my responsibility too, and I aim to honor that." Arjaka flooded through Aria, bringing unexpected tears to her eyes. She blinked them away, not wanting him to think she was overcome with emotion. "You need rest," Jack said, rising from the bed. "And proper food. I'll make some broth." He moved around the cabin with purpose, gathering supplies and stoking the fire. Aria watched him through half-closed eyes, noting the new tension in his shoulders, the careful way he glanced at her when he thought she wasn't looking. "I'll take care of you both," he said finally, breaking the silence. "You have my word on that." Aria nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Jack brought her a cup of warm broth, making sure she drank it all before stepping outside again. She expected him to return to splitting wood, but instead she heard different sounds. The scrape of wood being gathered, the measured tap of a hammer, the rhythmic rasp of a saw. Curious, Aria managed to shift slightly in the bed, trying to see through the window. Jack had set up a makeshift workbench near the cabin's side. As she watched, he carefully measured and marked several salvaged boards, his movements precise and Jack berate. The steady sawing continued through the afternoon. Each stroke seemed to speak of purpose, of plans being laid, of a future taking shape. Aria found herself listening to the rhythm, letting it lull her into a peaceful doze. When she woke again, the light was golden with approaching sunset. Jack came in, brushing sawdust from his clothes. His eyes met hers across the cabin, and something passed between them. Not quite a smile, but a softening, an acknowledgement of their shared situation. "What are you making?" Aria asked, though she thought she might already know. "Something that might be needed," he answered simply. "Rest now. There's time enough for everything else." As night fell gently over the mountain, Aria lay awake, listening to the familiar sounds of Jack moving around the cabin. He checked the fire, secured the door, and settled onto his bedroll near the stove. The distance between them seemed both smaller and larger than before. Smaller because of the life they'd created together, larger because of all the things they still needed to say. But there was a kind of peace in the silence now. Not the complete ease of hearts fully reconciled, but the nervous hope of two people beginning to see a path forward together. Arya's hand rested on her belly, fajacking the future stirring there. Outside, an owl called softly in the gathering dark. Inside, the fire crackled steadily, its warmth reaching into every corner of the small cabin, touching the half-finished rocking chair that stood as a promise in the shadows. Dawn painted the mountain peaks in shades of rose and gold, but Jack's mind was on practical matters. 2 days had passed since Arya's revelation, and their supplies were running dangerously low. The snow had crusted hard overnight, making travel possible if not comfortable. Inside the cabin, Jack checked his saddlebags while Arya stirred a pot of thin coffee over the stove. Her face was drawn with worry as she watched him prepare. "Something don't feel right," she said, wrapping her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Maybe you should wait another day." Jack paused, studying her face. The morning light streaming through the window caught the golden strands in her hair, making his heart twist unexpectedly. "We need supplies, Arya. Especially now." His voice softened on the last words, acknowledging their changing circumstances. "I know, but—" She pressed one hand absently to her belly, a gesture that had become familiar these past days. "I'll be back before sunset," Jack promised, shouldering his rifle. "Town's only 4 hours' ride in this weather. Keep the door barred while I'm gone." Arya nodded reluctantly, following him onto the small porch. The morning air bit sharp and clean, and their breath formed clouds in the stillness. Jack's mule stood ready, stamping occasionally in the crusty snow. He was reaching for the reins when movement caught his eye, a flash of dark cloth among the trees. His heart lurched. "Arya, get inside!" he shouted, swinging his rifle around. The warning came too late. 3 men burst from the tree line, weapons drawn. Jack recognized them instantly, Ruddick's men from the mining syndicate. He fired a warning shot that kicked up snow near their feet, but they kept coming. "Arya, the stove! Take cover!" Jack's voice cracked with urgency as he tried to position himself between her and the attackers. Arya darted back inside. Through the window he saw her crouch behind the iron stove, but his attention was ripped away as the first man reached him. They grappled for the rifle. A fist caught Jack's jaw, sending him stumbling. The sound of splintering wood pierced the air, the rear door giving way under heavy boots. Arya's scream cut off abruptly. Jack fought harder, desperation lending him strength, but a second man joined the fight. A rifle butt slammed into his ribs, driving the air from his lungs. "Stop fighting," a cold voice ordered, "or we'll hurt the woman." Jack looked up through blood-streaked vision. 2 men held Arya between them, one with a hand clamped over her mouth. Her eyes were wide with terror, but she stood straight-backed, refusing to show fear. "Let her go," Jack growled, struggling to rise. "She's with child." A harsh laugh answered him. "All the more reason for you to behave." The leader, a scarred man Jack knew as Fletcher, gestured to his men. "Tie him." Rough hands seized Jack's arms. He thrashed, earning another blow to the ribs, but went still when Fletcher pressed a knife to Arya's throat. The steel caught the morning light as Arya's pulse fluttered against it. "Please," Jack said hoarsely. "Don't hurt her." Fletcher smiled without warmth. "That depends on you, friend. Stay put while we have our talk with the widow." He nodded to his men. "Light it up. Make sure he can't follow." Horror dawned as one of the men pulled out a flask of coal oil. They dragged Arya away while the third man splashed the accelerant across the cabin's front wall. The smell of it filled the air, sharp and threatening. "No!" Jack lurched against his bonds, but the ropes held fast. A match flared. Flames leaped up the rough-hewn logs, catching quickly in the dry wood. Smoke began to curl under the eaves where the roof joined the walls. Inside, through the window, Jack could see the unfinished rocking chair he'd been crafting. A promise now turning to ash. Arya struggled as they pulled her toward their waiting horses, managing to wrench the gag free for a moment. "Jack!" she cried out, reaching toward him. "I'll find you!" he shouted back, his voice raw with anguish. "I swear it, Arya! I'll find you!" Then they were gone, hoofbeats fading into the forest. Jack worked frantically at his bonds as the fire spread, consuming the only real home he'd known in years. The heat blistered his skin. Smoke stung his eyes, bringing tears he refused to acknowledge. Finally, the ropes gave way. But it was too late to save anything. Jack stood helpless, watching as flames devoured the cabin. Everything he and Arya had begun to build together disappeared into the hungry blaze. The half-finished rocking chair, her shawl left draped across his bed, the letters that had brought them Taria, all of it turned to smoke and ash in the crystal-clear mountain morning. Dawn crept over the mountains, painting the smoke-filled sky in shades of gray and rose. Jack stood among the ruins of his cabin, watching embers glow beneath the blackened timbers. The air still held the acrid bite of burned wood and coal oil. With trembling hands, he sifted through the debris. Each piece told a story of what might have been. The charred remains of the rocking chair he'd crafted with such hope lay splintered and black. He touched one scorched runner, remembering how he'd shaped it for Arya, for their child. A leather corner peeked through the ash. Jack carefully extracted Jonas's letters, now fire-damaged but still partially legible. Beside them lay Arya's Bible, its pages curled and browned by heat. The sight of these remnants, these pieces of their shared Taria, broke something deep inside him. His knees gave way. Jack sank into the snow-dusted ashes, overwhelmed by the weight of it all. Arya was gone. Their unborn child was in danger. The thought of losing another family, of failing to protect those who needed him, crushed his chest like a vice. "Lord," he whispered, his voice rough with smoke and emotion. The word felt strange on his tongue. He hadn't prayed since, watching helplessly as fever took his siblings years ago. "I ain't worthy to ask, but she is. That baby is. Please." His words faltered, but his heart continued the plea. The morning wind whispered through the trees, carrying fresh snowflakes. Jack wiped his eyes with a soot-stained sleeve and pushed himself to his feet. Prayer had steadied something in him, rekindled a spark of hope he thought long dead. Working quickly, he gathered his rifle and what supplies remained. His mule had survived, having broken free during the attack. Jack saddled her with practiced hands, checking the tracks leading east. He recognized the direction. An old assay office lay that way, abandoned but sometimes used by syndicate agents. Snow began falling more steadily as he mounted up. The flakes melted on his face, washing away streaks of ash. Jack rode hard through the day, following signs only a mountain man would notice. Broken branches, displaced stones, occasional hoof prints in sheltered spots. As darkness approached, he spotted a faint glow through the trees. The assay office squatted against the mountainside, lamplight seeping through its grimy windows. Jack dismounted silently, securing his mule in a protected hollow. With careful movements, he checked his rifle and crept closer, his heart beating a steady rhythm of determination. The first light of dawn cast long shadows through the broken windows of the assay office. Jack moved silently, his boots carefully avoiding loose boards as he peered inside. His heart clenched at the sight of Arya tied to a wooden support beam, her face marked with bruises, but her eyes still defiant. Foreman Ruddock stood before her, holding out papers and a pen. "Sign these claim papers," he growled, "and this all ends quick." Arya lifted her chin. "I won't forge anything for you." Jack seized his moment. He burst through the window, glass tinkling across the floor. The nearest man turned, but Jack's rifle stock caught him hard across the temple. The man crumpled without a sound. "Drop it, Draven!" Ruddock's voice cut through the dusty air. He had Arya pulled against him, pistol pressed to her temple. "Or the widow gets to join her first husband." Jack lowered his rifle slowly, eyes locked on Arya. Her hand rested protectively over her belly, and something in her gaze told him she trusted him completely. "That's right," Ruddock sneered. "Now kick it over." In one fluid motion, Jack grabbed the lantern from the nearby table and hurled it. The glass shattered, oil spraying. Ruddock instinctively flinched away from the flames. Jack lunged, tackling him hard. The pistol clattered across the floor as they grappled. Moments later, Jack had Ruddock and his unconscious partner bound with their own belts. His hands trembled slightly as he untied Arya's ropes. She fell into his arms. "I couldn't sign," she whispered against his chest. "I wouldn't start our child's life with lies." Jack held her close, breathing in her presence. "You did right," he murmured. "We both did." Together they walked through the morning snow, Arya leaning heavily on his arm. The mule waited patiently where he'd left her. Jack helped Arya mount, then swung up behind her. As they rode away from the assay office, leaving Ruddock and his man for the law to find, Arya relaxed against him. The mountains stretched before them, touched with golden light, showing the way toward safety and their future. The Marstons' ranch spread across a peaceful valley, sheltered by towering pines. Caleb and Miriam Marston welcomed Arya and Jack without hesitation, leading them to the cozy bunkhouse where a wood stove already crackled with warmth. "You'll be safe here," Miriam said, pressing a bowl of hot stew into Arya's trembling hands. Her kind eyes took in the young widow's bruises with quiet concern. Days flowed together as Arya regained her strength. Marshal Collins arrived to collect the evidence: Jonas's letters, the forged claim papers, the broken survey marker. His weathered face grew stern as he studied them. "These records tell quite a tale," the marshal said, carefully wrapping the documents. "The territorial court will hear about this soon enough, that mining syndicate's days of stealing claims are numbered." While justice worked its slow path through the courts, Arya and Jack found peace in simple routines. Each morning, they helped Caleb with the barn chores. Arya's color returned as she gathered eggs and fed chickens, while Jack repaired fences alongside their host. In the evenings, they shared meals at the Marstons' table, the conversation flowing easier with each passing day. One crisp afternoon, Arya sat mending a quilt while Jack chopped firewood nearby. She caught him watching her, his expression soft with something more than friendship. "I've been thinking," he said later as they walked back from the barn, "about spring coming, about building something new." He stopped, taking her hands in his. "I know I'm not the man you expected to build a life with, but I want to try. For you and the little one." Tears welled in Arya's eyes. "I'd like that," she whispered. "Very much." The next morning, Caleb surprised them, pointing to a wagon stacked with fresh-cut lumber. "Miriam and I want you to have this," he said, "for rebuilding your homestead." "We can't possibly," Jack started, but Caleb raised his hand. "The Lord provides," Miriam said firmly, "sometimes through neighbors." Arya squeezed Jack's hand as they stood, looking at the lumber, the first pieces of their future together. The winter wind sang through the valley, but here, surrounded by friendship and newfound love, Spring didn't feel so far away. Spring crept into the valley like a gentle awakening. The creek ice melted first, then the meadow grass emerged in patches of tender green. Jack and Arya watched their new cabin take shape, smaller than the original, but built with stronger beams and deeper foundations. The Marstons' lumber proved just enough for the task. When the wildflowers dotted the creek bank with purple and gold, Arya's time drew near. The town midwife, Mrs. Henderson, arrived by wagon as the first pains began. Her calm presence steadied them both through the long hours that followed. "Keep breathing, dear," she encouraged Arya, while Jack paced outside, wearing a path in the spring earth. As dawn painted the mountains pink, their son's first cry split the air. Mrs. Henderson cleaned and swaddled the robust baby boy before placing him in Jack's trembling arms. "He's perfect," Jack whispered, tears tracking down his weathered cheeks. He held his son close against his chest, overcome. "I swore I'd never be a father, was too afraid after losing my family. But this is God's mercy, plain as day." Arya reached for them both, her eyes shining. "You saved my life that day on the mountain," she said softly. "Then you chose me again. Chose us. That's mercy, too." Weeks later, their small clearing filled with neighbors for the blessing ceremony. Jack planted a young apple sapling near the cabin's corner, its tender leaves catching the morning light. "I promise to raise you with gentleness," he murmured to his son, "with Tarja and love, so help me God." Peace settled over their homestead like a warm blanket, while the ancient mountains stood silent, witness to love's renewal. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.